they resubmit the story. The copy editor, within that 24 hours, resubmits the story. We still use email. I know some of you guys use Google Docs and stuff like that. It's the same process. We still use email. We've always used it. It works really well for us. Then the copy editor prints out a hard copy of that story, and they put it in my basket. I have a series of baskets in my classroom, and one is for me. Copy editor puts a story in my basket. And I then have a week, the conference with the students who have written the stories, with the copy edited version of the story. And so when I see that kid in class, let's say Monday, so they submitted the story Friday, and I see that student in class on Monday, I will take time to read through the story, and I will sit down with the kid, and we'll talk about it. And for the veteran kids, those are really pretty quick conversations. It's, hey, I noticed you do this. A lot of times I have grammatical conversations with them, like, let's talk about the unnecessary that. You know, we'll circle them all, or, you know, let's look at the way that you punctuated your quotes. You've done that incorrectly. But sometimes it's bigger than that. You know, you buried your lead. You know, this is supposed to be a story about this, but you put it way down here. We need to move it up to the top. Or, you know, you failed to ask this question, or you really need to go talk to this particular person in order to be fair and balanced in this particular story. Or in some cases, particularly for newer staff members, they still haven't quite grasped that concept of angle yet, and so they struggle to tell me even what the story's about. Like, why do I care? And so they'll struggle. Sometimes I'll just turn the paper over and I'll say, you just tell me, like a thesis statement. Like, what is it you want me to think about? And then they'll be able to verbalize it. I'll say, there's your nut graph, there's your angle. Now go write that. All right? And so then they have time to go back and do the things that they need to do. It's quick stuff, like style. They'll just make the corrections, usually on our server, and then the editor will replace the story with the corrections. It's all good. If it's a bigger correction, the reporter will go to the editor. Say, Brandon is my editor. I'll go over to Brandon and I'll say, hey, you know, I talked to Mr. Streisand. He said I need to do this. Just wanted to let you know. And Brandon will say, okay, well, can I get that by Wednesday? Right? Yeah, I can get to you by Wednesday. Or no, I can get it to you Thursday morning. Okay, that's your next deadline, Thursday morning. Because he still has to be able to get it on the new version on his page. What's the rest of my staff doing in all of this? Well, we're proofreading. Every staff member has a proofreading requirement during that week of production. So they're all checking names, and they're, you know, going online to double check URL references. They're using their style manuals to correct their style. My management team is looking at design. Photographers are discussing maybe better photo options, so that, you know, we've got one on the page because they met first page deadline, but here's a better one that's presented itself. Let's see if we can replace it. And it works pretty smoothly. It takes a little while for kids to sort of buy into it. But once they do, they start to see the value in it. But it's because that information gathering stage always takes longer than you think that oftentimes is one of the reasons why staff stay as long as they do. And then you've also got to be consistent. I don't give extensions on deadlines. Well, so-and-so wasn't available. Then I go, okay, well, what was your plan B? Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes plan B is another source. Sometimes it's a completely different story. I encourage my editors to have what I call back pocket stories. If the proverbial shit hits the fan, the story falls apart, or do you have something else that you can stick in there? It may not be as cool as what you wanted, but it's another story entirely. You can just plug in and fill that space, because we can't just cut pages. Because if I cut your page, I got to cut the page on the other side of that too. And you go explain that to that editor. The hard work that they did now doesn't get printed. I mean, those are all the conversations that we have. So I'm pretty firm on the no deadline extension rule. Because once you start going down that path, it gets pretty easy to continue on that path. So you've got to make a pretty solid case for that.
So, okay, so this is for your printed publication. That also becomes an issued document. What is your deadline process for the online?
It's a rolling deadline. They're really, we have some deep reports which we'll actually get to. The news briefs that have a more strict deadline, and then the other stuff is usually kind of case-by-case basis. Okay. As the stories present themselves, we'll set separate deadlines for those.
So you do set deadlines?
We do. I mean, there's always a deadline. And clearly, the stuff that's online, typically the window of opportunity to publish that is pretty short. So we want to get it out as quickly as we can. Right. Whereas with print, the window, like we talked about, the magazine that sits on the table for a while, that deadline is always a little more firm because we have pages that have a longer shelf life.
Do you have a different staff?
Nope, same staff.
Okay.
Yeah. Those who write for the web also write for print, vice versa.
Those are rough draft deadlines that we're talking about, the first draft?
The first draft would be as polished a deadline as they can. So if the editor needs a story that's 600 words long, and there's always requirements for me. For me, for example, a printed story always has to have 3 sources. We'll get to that when we talk about interviewing. Like a beat report or news brief, typically it's 2, a student source and an adult expert source, but a printed story typically has 3. So it's a main face for student, an expert source, and then a secondary source, whether that's an adult or another student, nothing more than that. But so it has to meet those criteria. So when you say rough draft, it couldn't be like, well, here's 200 words, and I'll get you the rest later. It's got to meet that criteria. In other words, it's what for a writer would be what they consider to be their best effort, their best story. For a veteran, it's a pretty polished piece of writing. It doesn't mean there aren't tweaks that we can make to it, but for a younger reporter who's relatively new at it, this is what I can do. This is the best I can do at this moment without the benefit of talking to like me and having them help out.
Oh, just a follow-up to that real fast. What's your, so after that one draft is done, I'm guessing the editor just needs to read it as soon as possible, and then if anything's dire, they send it back and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Or if not, just run it with a few corrections.
Well, and the editor knows that they can't place a story on a page until it has an E in front of it. My copy editors, when they look through the story, and they copy edit it, and they resubmit it, and they put a little E in front of the document, which indicates it's a copy edited document. So at least it's gone through one set of eyes, and then the editor obviously has it to look through in place, and then I'll look at it, and we'll converse, and then it goes through the proofreading process as well. That's why I never understand when there are glaring errors in the paper. I gave my kids a big yell this past fall week, or spring, we had our Acumen that came out. It was the fashion issue. 3 S's right in the word issue on the cover. There were 23 words on the front page. I look back, we had 27 people that could have caught the fact that issue was misspelled. And that includes like our PDF checklist, which is supposed to be a spell check of the page, right? Nothing. So all those kids lost points. And we can talk about this stuff later if you guys want to break out or something like that. Speaking of, you guys should be thinking about what you want to discuss at the breakout session today. And we can do that. But at any rate, when you say first draft, though, it's a polished piece of writing as that kid can produce that meets the criteria.
How do you manage it if you don't have an editorial staff and you don't have copy editors and you're the only one that's reading all of their articles?
I would work very quickly to start putting some things in the hands of students as much as you can. Many hands make light work, and you've got to start getting that trust built with some of your students. I know, are you the one that has the brand new staff and you're not sure yet? Is that what's going on? I can't remember.
I
You guys
had like
moved on
4
me.
people last year and they were all seniors and
Okay.
they never showed up anyway.
And that's an added challenge. The benefit of having only 4 people is that you probably don't have as much content coming through.
Well, I had a class that had 6 kids in it, so that was
Okay, but
awesome.
even there with 6 or 10 kids, I mean,
That's
that's relatively
And it was
small in the
hard to
scheme
keep
of
up
things, and I'm
with
sure your paper
theirs.
probably isn't as
Yeah.
long either. And that's a lot easier. The bigger your staff gets, the more you need things in the hand. We talked about like the web, you know, how it all used to funnel into those 2 or 3 kids who knew code, and then when content management systems came out, it was great, because now we could put the content into the hands of those who actually knew content and not those who just knew web coding. And that was what you want. So you just got to find those people that you can trust. Maybe it's just a couple of really bright kids who at least can get a couple of eyes on that.
How many stories do your kids get assigned? Is it 1 story per issue for?
There's no set number. Every kid does news briefs on a regular basis. And then as far as the bigger stories, they put preferred teams. So if I'm a new staff member, I can pick if I want to be a sports writer or a feature writer or a news writer. And then I'll go to the Maestro meetings. We'll talk about brainstorming a little later on. We'll go to a Maestro meeting or a budgeting meeting, if you want to call it that. And that's where they pitch story ideas. They're required by their editors to bring story ideas. The editors actually keep track of who brings story ideas because I get points associated with that. But just because they pitch the story doesn't mean they're going to run the story. But from the pitches of stories, then that gives them a whole lot of stories to choose from, and then they'll pick from that which ones they want to cover and then who's going to do it. Sometimes you'll get a kid who has a couple of stories in an issue, and you'll have another kid who doesn't have any in that issue, but they'll have one maybe down the road. We do keep a Google spreadsheet. Where's Rochelle? There you go. We use Google spreadsheets where we have every student on staff listed down one side, and then we have all our issue dates across the top. And then when they get a story assignment, the editor, who's in charge will add the assignment to their little box, where the name and the date converge. When they add an assignment, the box, that little box turns yellow. When they get a second assignment, it turns orange. Okay? If you add a third assignment, it turns red. You're not supposed to do that. It means that, look, you've got all these other people who are also available to help you here, and it spreads it out. And then at a glance, as a teacher, you can look at that spreadsheet and see, over the course of maybe a few issues, who's getting the brunt of the assignments and who's not. You could also adapt that and even add online elements and things like that, just to see that the wealth is getting shared. Now, keeping in mind that not every kid is a reporter, but it's assignments. So you've got some kids who are photographers or graphics people. It's a matter of the number of assignments that they have. We try to keep it as fair as possible. You'll always have a staff, like one kid who's like your go-to kid, who never complains, but they always get like 20 things, and that's not fair to that kid. And you've got other kids who are equally capable of doing that.
Are you going to talk about how you apply that to online, or is that later, or do you want to?
Well, and we'll talk about the writing styles and how that all works. We get our online stories in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's those enterprise stories that have a time angle. We didn't run them in print, but we still want them to show up for readers, so we'll decide to put those online. Sometimes it's those news briefs, which we'll get to, and some of it is like teachers. Those stories that pop up, hey, our class is doing this cool project on Tuesday. You should send a photographer down, and so we'll do that. We keep an online stories board in the room where it's just my management team will just randomly assign a kid from that period to go cover that story. They do. It's a little less intense. Again, those are typically stories that aren't going to get me fired, because they're typically by converted pyramid, like news brief stories, who, what, when, where. Most of them, not all. It's a little more challenging. Like I told you that story about the kid who took the picture of the girl who had the seizure. That gets to be more of a community conversation, and then we'll decide how we want to play that out. But for the most part, those stories don't. I often don't even see them until they get online.
Yeah, that's because what I've been doing is letting my managing editor look at them, and then she publishes them.
I always remember that my role in the staff, I am not the teacher of the highlight staff. I'm the advisor for the highlight staff. And I always try to remind myself sometimes that, it's their paper, it's their conversation, it's their challenge. I am there to play devil's advocate. I am there to provide feedback. I'm there to provide what I hope is sort of an expert bit of knowledge. I'm there too, as sort of publisher, I'm there to say, hey, now, I never say we're not going to run the story, but sometimes I'll say we can't run the story as it sits. It's a good story, but it's not ready to go, and it's typically because of some legal concern. And so then we'll talk about, well, what can happen to the story to make it better. The good news about those kinds of stories is that they often have a longer shelf life, so that you can, if it doesn't run in that particular issue, again, making sure your editors have a plan B, that it can get pushed to the next issue, and I can tell you stories about some of those kinds down the way. But I do want to move forward, because the writing process also takes time, and a good chunk of it.
Do you mind, I don't know if this is the time, but do you mind sharing your schedule that you have?
I can. I mean, it's nothing really written down, like a calendar to me.
Yeah.
But I can jot it down for you at maybe a break or something like that, just so you have that. It's nothing really that formal, because it does fluctuate a little bit, but it keeps me sane. Heck, I've got my own set of schedule. I mean, you guys who have kids know exactly what that's like. My kid's going to be in high school next year, and with soccer and all that, it's going to be crazy. So I've got to live outside of my own classroom too, and you do too.
I didn't mean your personal schedule, I meant the schedule for when the article comes in, from brainstorming to
Again, that fluctuates because my editors set those deadlines.
Okay.
If it's a long story, if it's a big story that they're looking for a cover story, they may be planning that 2 months early, so that the reporter has a big chunk of time. That big 40% chunk could become like 60%, depending on the story. If it's a story that doesn't take as long, 15 minutes of fame typically is pretty short. It's Q&A. You need maybe 20% because it's a one source kind of thing. And then there's the writing process that also takes time. And for those bigger stories, it's going to take longer than other stories. The idea here is that not every story takes the same amount of time. The earlier you can plan it, again, work smarter, not harder. The earlier you can plan it, the more you're going to work here, right? But if you're going with an issue-to-issue mentality, the poor kid who's doing that really big cover story is going to be working way up here, trying to get it done, whereas the kid who's doing just some mundane news brief is gonna be down in here. So you've gotta stretch that other kid out a little bit further to give them time to work long-term.
Okay, so I have some students on my staff who only want to do the easy, breezy news brief all the time, and they're sort of like at this like, I'm comfortable here, it's not hard, I know the formula, that sort of thing. And I keep trying to push them to go deeper and to find the big stories, and they just like push back against that. How do you?
That's where my final exam project comes into play.
Okay.
Every kid is required to do an enterprise project, and those stories are typically the longer narrative pieces, the more thought-provoking, issue-based kinds of stories. We may not run it, but they have to do it.
Okay.
And then you will have some kids that will coast. You know, I wish I had an easy answer for that. We talked a lot last year in our staff about engagement. Like, what does it look like to be engaged in work? And when we started doing all this like teacher evaluation stuff, and you're supposed to like look like every kid is doing what they're supposed to do. Well, my classroom didn't used to look like that. You know, I would have days where I'd have some kids working really hard, and a couple of other kids didn't look like they were working as hard. But it's not that they weren't working. It's just that a lot of work in journalism happened sometimes outside the classroom. Their interviews and things happened after school or on the weekend. They wrote better at night rather than in a noisy classroom or whatever. It's not that they weren't working. And so there a couple of years ago, I was like, you know, got my whip out and I'm like, start working, and it really killed the vibe in the room, right? The kids were just doing busy work, and that was stupid. And so then I started thinking, well, screw that teacher evaluation stuff. We're going back to the way we used to do it. We are. We're going back to that idea that, you know, but you're always going to have some kids that are going to coast. They're going to surf. And so you can have some things in place that at least can identify who they are, and then you can find some things. My editors would do this. They made a job jar in the room, and because they wanted to make sure the kids were engaged. And they saw somebody who looked like they were slacking, they go, okay, put the job jar. Sometimes it was go write a quick news story, or take a photo of the day, or sometimes it was like clean the keyboards, you know, because they're gross. But it made everybody a productive member of the staff, and so that's key. But just be careful too of those kids that get overwhelmed with a lot of work, because that's a lot of stuff to do and balance, and a lot of those kids have obviously other classes and things that they're trying to do to get there. You can see that the editing section takes a lot, but the actual publications, like the big payoff, is very, very short. All that hard work for what? I mean, you think of the World Cup. And Germany had a moment that lasted about 20 minutes where they got to hold the World Cup trophy aloft and enjoy it. Now it's backward. Here we go. So we're going to break this down. Brainstorming, which we've sort of already talked about, does involve those news values. So what's happening in your school, their new policies or their upcoming events. The hard part about print is timeliness. Now, what I always remind my kids is don't think about, like today is, let's say we have a paper that's coming out August 1st. And today is July 15th. We can't think about the story as it's relevant July 15th or even July 22nd. We have to push our thinking forward to say the first time a reader is going to see this story is August 1st. So what is timely on or after August 1st? Okay, so when they bring story ideas to the table and they're brainstorming with their staffs, they have to be thinking about previewing, not reviewing. It's a big frustration for me when I critique print publications. And I say print because it's okay to review it online because you have that window to do that. If you go see a movie and you can review it like that night or even the next day, that's absolutely fine. But if you do it 4 days later, it's lost its impact, right? When I see print publications and I critique them and I see that they have nothing but old news, well, that's not a valuable piece of information. You know, hey, the team won the state championship 4 weeks ago. Really? Who doesn't know that? What rock are they living under that they didn't know that they won the state championship? You've got to preview. And that's hard for kids to get their heads around sometimes. So it's important for them to look at a calendar and look at August's calendar, for example, and not the current calendar that they're in. And think about those things that are coming up, and then how can we do a story about that? Sometimes what they'll do to brainstorm is this idea of localization. My kids love to read things like Time Magazine and Pew Research and New York Times, and they'll see some stories that maybe talk about a new study that's come out, or new data about this, or those kind of did you know moments. And they'll bring that and they'll say, we could localize, I wonder if we could do this. Like, if there's something going on, remember all the unrest that was going on in Egypt there for a while. And the kids wanted to localize that story. Well, they went and they found some kids who lived in Egypt, whose families still live in Egypt, and we did a localized story about the impact and what that means for Egypt from kids who are from there. That's that localization, but it's still timely, right, about a moment like that.
So that story, is that something that you would put online, or is that something?
We put it in print.
Sure that you put?
We did put it in print. Because we knew, in that case, we knew that story was going to be kind of ongoing. We knew that there was a larger window of opportunity. You've got to watch out for that, though, sometimes. Sometimes stories that are done and they're over. And what you thought was going to be this big thing falls apart. So it's done. What do we do now? You got to be careful of that. So finding stories that have a much larger time window that you think that's going to go on for a while. We need to localize. Sometimes it's stuff like, hey, spring break's coming up. And we're in an economic downturn, like several years ago. Like, what is that going to mean as we do our spring break issue? Like, how does that affect student travel plans? Are kids not traveling places because they can't afford to go? Those kinds of things. You look like, it's always preview, looking ahead to what's coming up so that news is still relevant. If you want to cover the football team, you're thinking about like what's coming up for the football team, not what's going to already happen in the next couple of weeks, but what is coming up for that team in the next month. Preview, not review. When you brainstorm, you need to ask these questions. Why should I care? What don't readers already know about it? How will it impact them? The thing, why are we telling the story, and not just why are we telling it, why are we telling it now? A lot of kids will want to sort of like, oh, I want to write about like teen drinking. Right? Young kid. Don't blow the lid off the teen drinking problem that's going on in our high school. I'm going to pull it here. Right out of the gate, my story about teen drinking. And I'll look at them and I'll say, well, why? Well, because, teens drink. Since the dawn of time, there have been teens, and there have been alcohol. And those two have gotten together on occasion. It's not news. Why are you telling it to me now? All right? And that's where the research comes in. That's where your justification for telling. A lot of folks, you see stories about censorship. I know Frank Lamonti will talk a little bit about this too. You see stories about censorship or problematic stories or anonymous source stories about drugs or whatever. You name your taboo subject, it's probably been censored at some point in some school. We've never had that problem, knock on wood, for a couple of reasons. One, and some of the minor reasons, one, we never use anonymous sources, and we always talk to the parents. I'm going to do that process before. It's a potential FERPA kind of a thing. But the biggest reason is that we always have, and I always make sure my kids have a journalistic justification for telling that story. If you can tell me that we're writing a story about teen drinking because a new study just came out that said that a growing number of teens is starting to drink a particular kind of alcohol. Why? Because it's more readily available to them. Now we have some justification for telling that story. We're localizing it. What's the one I'm trying to think of? Sex.
Safe sex.
Sex stories are always red flags. Again, since the dawn of time, teens and sex, typically alcohol is involved. This was lots of years ago, but they did a survey, probably Pew or one of the big survey organizations, the survey among young people. And it was talking about whether or not they were sexually active, not sexually active, and then why. Well, they did the survey 25 years prior, 20 years prior. And a portion of students, and again, this was a while ago, so the numbers are wrong, but it doesn't really matter. Let's say 20% of students said that they were abstinent. 20, 25 years ago. And the number one reason why they said that they were sexually abstinent, any guesses? What? Yeah, 25 years. Oh,
You wanna get pregnant?
boom, religion. Their religion said it was wrong, so that was why they were abstinent. So flash forward 25 years, which for us would have been about 10 years ago. Same survey. Numbers, remarkably similar. 20% of students said they were abstinent. Religion, though, had fallen precipitously as the number one reason why. It became more concerns about family, about job, career, whatever. Religion had dropped. So our story, while it was about sex and abstinence, wasn't really about sex and abstinence. It was a story, it was about the new generation of young people who don't have, many of them don't look at religion as such a prominent, playing such a prominent role in their lives. Right? It was a really well done story. It could have been problematic. Why? Because it's about sex, right? But it wasn't. It was a very good journalistic story. It had research to back it. Right? Why did you tell that story? Here's why. And you can hand it to them. You can hand the survey. You can hand the document, the data. You are on much better ground defending a story if you know why you're telling it right now. Okay? The thing about those taboo stories is they are always there. And you can tell the kid, look, it's not that it's not an interesting idea, it's just not ready yet. But it'll come around. And that story will be ready to tell at some point. And when it is, we're going to do it right. And it's going to be awesome. And it's going to be valuable to our readers. So be thinking about those kinds of conversations. What's the point? Why would we tell it to you? Are we just trying to rile things up? Or are we trying to give you information that you don't know? To give you something to think about. I often say it this way. It makes a reader go, I never thought of it that way. Or, I never even thought to think of it that way. I'll read a story. I read aloud to my kids every day. My newspaper one particularly, but sometimes to my highlight staff. Reading excellent examples of journalism. And Matthew Tully is a columnist in Indianapolis. He works for the Indianapolis Star. I actually came in and spoke to my kids at the end of the year. He wrote a series of articles about a really, well, it's been since taken over by the state, but it was a terrible school in inner city Indianapolis, Manual High School. Had a lot of struggles there. And he went in for about a year off and on, just visiting the school, talking with kids, talking with teachers, and he did tell some of the stories that you'd expect to see about, the problem kids and some of the challenges that they face. But then he would also tell stories about, the amazing special needs program that they have at Manual High School. And he went on this trip with these special needs kids to it's called Hollyhock Hill. It's this quaint little restaurant where the kids were learning how to work in an environment, be polite, and use their manners and all this. And he talked with two girls who were going to be the first in their families to go to college. And so he talked about the performing arts department, and it was this beacon. And when he wrote about performing, he talked about this teacher, Spencer Lloyd was his name. He was just this powerful, leader of these kids. And no matter what baggage those kids brought in with them, they left it at the door when they came in to sing for him. To the point where when he wrote his column about it, he mentioned that they were going to do a Christmas program. They had to add 3 extra shows. People from all over the region came to visit and donate to the program and help them out. It's huge, right? It's impactful. But it was that thing like, look, that story is not written for people who go to Manual High School. When Ron Suskind wrote A Hope in the Unseen, if anyone's ever seen that, you should read that book. It was based on a couple of articles he did for the New York Times about a kid named Cedric Jennings who goes to Frank W. Ballou High School. Anybody live in that area? Washington, D.C. It is probably one of the worst schools in the country. They have 1,350 kids at this school, and 80 kids, 80 have a B or better average. The lead on that story was recently a person was shot dead outside Frank W. Ballou High School. 5 fires were set by arsonists. An unidentified body was in the parking lot, and another student hacked another student with an axe. Ron Suskind wrote that story. He didn't write it for Frank W. Blue High School. He wrote it for us. What's the point of telling that story? It's to open your eyes to somebody else's story, to share that story. Remember, we're all about stories, right? So it's finding those stories and then saying, this is why I want to tell it, because this is something that you didn't think about before. Maybe you never even thought to think about it before. You just drive past Manual High School every day on your way to your nice little job at Eli Lilly, and you don't even think about it because it's over there. And you categorize it in your mind, if you ever thought about it, you categorize it as, oh, it's just a mess. There's nothing we can do about it. It's so black and white. You know, it's so easy to just... And then you see that story, and all of a sudden it's gray. Right? That's what you want your kids to do, is find those stories. There's some great ones out there. You just got to go looking for them. And that's the impact that you can have. And that's the power of story. I know I've sort of sidetracked just a slight bit, but I do have to make sure that you understand that concept of story. And what journalists bring to the table. And why those pieces that I mentioned, like Ron Suskind's pieces and Matt Tully's pieces. And it comes down to opening your mind and your heart to thinking about the world in a different way. If you've ever been in an argument with somebody, and they're pro-life and you're pro-choice, you argue back and forth. Have you ever been in one of those arguments and the other person just stopped in the middle and went, you're right, I quit, I'm over on your side now? Has it ever happened? Like in the history of Fox News? Has it ever happened? No. It's just a bunch of shouting voices, and all you do is further entrench yourself in your own belief system, and you're not even listening to what the person's saying. You're just thinking about your counter for what they're going to say, right? But if you've ever had a moment in your life that has gotten to the quick with that issue, say the pro-life, pro-choice thing. Let's say you're staunchly pro-life, and then something happens to you, to a family member, to a friend. I'm not saying you're going to change your mind, but at that moment, you're open to it. Because you see it differently. You understand it differently. You ever read a book or see a movie that made you cry? And when I tell this to my students, I'll say to the guys, it's a sports movie, it's okay. Old Yeller, okay. Pets, sports people, it's okay. Right? You have this visceral reaction, right? I remember seeing Rocky IV. Premiere of Rocky IV. I can say this to you guys so you understand this reference. Middle of the Cold War, right? Rocky loses, Apollo Creed dies. Rocky's doing his training, right? He's out in the middle of the wilderness, and he's doing carrying logs, walking up snow, and then you got Ivan Drago doing his steroids and this high-tech facility, and then you see him in there in the ring. Rocky's so small compared to Drago, and Drago's just beating the crap out of him. And this always happens. Rocky gets up. When that happened, when I saw it in the premiere, the crowd cheered. Like, we're not even there. We were cheering like we were there. It was so powerful. When I read Lords of Discipline, which is one of my favorite books, my background. Anybody read Lords of Discipline? I don't want to give it away if you've never read it. There's a moment one of his best friends does something, I was so mad, I threw the book across the room. I'll ask my kids about Harry Potter. I said, did you like Harry Potter? Like, yeah, love Harry Potter. Like, you connected with Harry Potter, didn't you? Yeah. Like, you were upset when things happened to Harry, right? Yeah. Look, Harry Potter's not even freaking real. You loved him. You loved Harry Potter. When we tell stories as journalists, we get to tell stories about real people. And that's what makes that extremely powerful. It's not Rocky, it's not Harry Potter, it's a real person. Cedric Jennings was a real dude. Matt Tully went to Manual High School and told stories of real people. That is the power of journalism. What we can do with stories, just like you had that moment where you got to the quick of the issue for you personally, when we read someone's story, we can sort of do that. We can sort of give the person the experience without actually experiencing it themselves. If you are a good storyteller, you can give people that experience. And it opens their mind and their heart to thinking about things a little bit differently. It may not change their mind. Our goal is not to change minds. But our goal is to give you something to think about, and that's those questions that we talk about in the brainstorm session. We've got to make sure that the story we're telling is valid. Why are we telling it to you? Sometimes it's simple. Sometimes it's just it's a lot of good information. It's news. They need to know it. Broccoli, right? But sometimes it's more than that. And we have to know that. Now, this is the part that takes a little bit longer, the gathering of information.
Let me, you may be prepared to answer the question right now, but as you talk about those without having done the reporting, it looks like to me I would be answering those questions in kind of the abstract and answering in a way that forced me to find information in my reporting that fulfilled my theoretical proposition. I wonder if brainstorming doesn't need to come after.
You can do it both ways, really. Sometimes stories present themselves.
Yeah.
Sources present themselves. You know, there's an intriguing story, and then it's a matter of, well, how do we go about covering it? But sometimes it's a localization thing. It's like, we want to cover this story. We need to know how to do it.
Okay.
And then that's when we go into, you're right, and again, I said it was sort of the cyclical process as opposed to this sort of linear process, but for lack of a better way of looking at it, all of these parts are part of it. Sometimes the brainstorming can happen after you do the interviews and you realize the story has changed. You know, the sources said something that you weren't expecting, and it's gone a different route. We did a story, there have been a couple of very high-profile cases of bullying of gay students around the country, actually, and a couple of them were in Indiana, and 2 kids in Indiana had actually killed themselves because of excessive bullying, because they were homosexual. And so we wanted to do a story at Carmel to find out sort of what the mindset at Carmel was in terms of its student body's treatment of kids who were homosexual. And they found a kid who is openly gay, went on record, we talked to his parents, he was fine with it, so we went through that process. But what he said was, Carmel was actually extremely welcoming of the gay community. He said he never felt any fear or problems of bullying or any of that. That the kids at Carmel were pretty open to all of those kinds of things. The administration sort of backed that up and stuff. So, you know, we thought it was going to be, you know, a story that was about bullying and that it's happening everywhere. But what we found is it went a different way. We had to go back to the drawing board and say, well, how does that story proceed? We ended up it ended up winning an NSPA award for Diversity Story of the Year. It's called Progress, and it was a really cool experience for the kids, but it's also one where you really have to listen to your sources and see what they're saying, so that you tell the right story. But it went back to, we had to go brainstorm again.
Yeah, okay.
To find out, all right, well, knowing that, then what do we need for that particular story? Because that's what our sources tell us. We're not going to force the angle. If that's not the angle, then we got to go try a different route. So, but then we get into that gathering of information, and this is really where all that work comes in. That 40% or 60% or however much you want to talk about, depending on the story, is where it comes in. And I always break it down into 3 parts: interviewing, observation, and research. Any semblance of these 3 will make a story, depending on the story. For example, like a quick news brief, I'm not going to have a whole lot of observation in it. But clearly a big narrative piece, you're going to want to try to provide that human interest to it, and that's partly some of the techniques of great writers like Ron Suskind, Roy Peter Clark, and Tom French, and some of these great reporters, what's his name, who wrote Final Salute for the Rocky Mountain News before it went on the Pulitzer for it. Jim Sheehan. They incorporate lots of elements of observation, which really takes a lot more time. But when most people think about reporters, they think of that fedora hat and the reporter's notebook and the pen. And that's really where interviewing is. Now, interviewing clearly takes a lot of different forms, but as we talk about it, we want to take a little sidetrack here. There it was. It should work now. We sort of blend into interviewing 101. By the way, fake AP style book, also great to follow on. So we learned 2 things: sarcastic Rover, fake AP style. I just tell my students it's important that you know their angle before they go into the story. They should know why they're telling the story before they go into it.
Depends on which one it is.
One's a fake.
What's that?
There's 2 fake AP styles.
Are there 2 now?
Well, one's a fake, I guess.
Oh, the fake AP style.
So which one is it?
I don't know.
There's one that says it won an award, follow that one.
That could be fake though.
Actually, follow the one with more followers.
Is it the one with the exclamation point and the question mark?
It was like a rogue, fake geeky style book person wasn't getting the credit he wanted to.
One says style book and one says BOOX.
Books?
Oh,
The
actually,
one with the same icon that he has on his is probably.
Which was the icon?
There it is.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, thank you.
okay, that's fine.
Now you're not gonna pay attention, you're just gonna be calm. I get it. So again, it goes back to what do you want readers to think about, why you're telling the story, what research should you conduct, and research is part of that process. And then again, Roger, to your point, is something that can happen really at all times, again, that research. But it's important to do some research beforehand. This is one of the benefits of a veteran reporter when they cover a beat. A lot of this stuff is sort of innate. If I'm covering the Colts, and I've covered them for years, then I know a lot of stuff about them. But if I'm new to this, I'm gonna have to do a whole lot more research beforehand, so that I don't look like an idiot when I talk to my source. And I can ask better questions. This is one of those too where kids will ask, well, should I study journalism in college? Well, yeah, I mean, it's great. I don't want to disparage the journalism program, but it's also good to have other degrees. Like if you have a biology degree or a business degree or a political science degree, then you also have a bit of knowledge that you can bring to the table if you go interview a scientist or a doctor or a lawyer or a politician that helps you understand that world a little bit better. So your kids also come to the table with that knowledge. But then that idea of who should you interview, this is that sourcing that we talked about. So we've got what I call main face. Now for your students, it's typically a student. Because students listen more to students. This is the person who the news affects. That adage of if the tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it doesn't make a sound. Likewise, if something happens in your school and nobody is affected, is it news? If somebody's affected, then it's probably news. At least news to them, right? You can ignore the whole idea of it's introduced in the lead because it's more of a narrative structure, but they should be in the story. Okay, if it's an inverted pyramid, it really is the most prominent source, the most important source first, and then the lesser important. But with a narrative, I like to get the student into that source.
On the last slide, you were saying to know your angle before the interview. I've actually found that sometimes kind of a problem because when I'll tell my kids that, they'll come up with questions, they'll do the research, but then they don't listen.
Yeah, and that's...
Like they don't listen to the interview because...
We're going to talk about this because there's a filter question that you ask in a series of questions, and you hope that if you did your research right, and you think 99% of the time you kind of know how they're going to respond before you say it, but what if they say no?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do? And that's a challenge.
Hard time trying to I didn't know how to make them listen because I would have stories where they would write a story about, because someone does lacrosse and they're such a great athlete, and then buried in the story they'll say, but they hate lacrosse.
Yeah.
They just do it because they're good at it. And I'm like, why is your story not about that?
Right.
And I'll have them, I'll get on them for that. And I had a hard time. Actually, you brought it up earlier. One thing that I found to help me out a little bit was I had them just read Rolling Stone. And I know I probably didn't trouble because it's edgy. But when they would read those Q&As, they would actually show that they have a conversation with them rather than just interviewing. But that's such a hard thing.
Yeah, and seeing interviews Bill Moyer did a fantastic interview with back in the day, Joseph Campbell about mythology and stuff. It was just fascinating to watch. I mean, you're right. I think professionals sometimes don't listen either. What was that one that was pretty high profile where the woman on the news station was interviewing a guy who was a religious studies professor, but he happened to be Islamic, and he had written a story about Jesus or something like that. And she kept harping on the fact that how can you be an expert on, and he kept going back to the fact that I have this degree in this, and I have this, and I've got these many books out. She wasn't listening. She clearly was not listening to that. And she's supposedly a professional. I mean, it happens everywhere. You're right. The goal is that hopefully and I will say 9 times out of 10, they're going to get the answer they're expecting. But you're right. There's that percentage of time where they don't. You kind of got to handle that on a case-by-case basis, I guess. Or just prepare them what happens if they say no. Well, then you got to go off the cuff. You got to start going off the fly and find out more.
It's not a typical journalism movie, but I let my kids watch that Spike Lee documentary on Hurricane Katrina.
Requiem for,
Yeah, because the woman who was doing most of the interviewing or the speaking, you didn't know what questions they were asking, but she was giving such emotional answers. It's like, what do you think they were asking?
Almost go backwards and dissect. That's another thing to do.
Yeah,
Some great stories, dissect and say, what do you think they asked them to get this great response? I always have an expert source. 9 times, most of the time it's an adult, somebody who is relevant to the story in some way. It could be in your school, it could be outside the school. It really depends. It's like a news brief, and it's a story about the chess club. It's like the sponsor of the chess club. What the expert does is provide credibility to the story. Students provide the face, the connection to the story, but the adults provide a credibility that this is really happening, and here's legitimate people who are actually talking about it, who have some experience with this larger story. And then you can add sources, depending on the story. Now, if it's a news brief, it's going to be, and again, this is on the slide share too. So yeah.
Oh, there's some slide.
Yeah. But you can add sources then. For a quick news brief, 200-word story, I mean, really just the first 2 for me are fine. But the longer the story, the more sources you want to bring in. Now, it could be more faces. It could be other kids, for example, who also have had this happen to them, or it could be people who have an opposite view, because you want to provide that other viewpoint as well. Or it could be additional experts who, to a lesser extent, have some role in that story. And then, preparing. This is the thing you've got to make sure your kids are prepared. I teach professionalism all the time. There's, again, another great transferable skill. Time management and professionalism. I have a whole slide presentation on just, I call it teaching with Mr. Manners. But I use like the actual examples of students, like email correspondences and stuff that are terrible. I take their names out, but then I show them and they're like, why is that bad? And how can you make that better? Because they forget that the first impression that they often will have, or maybe in some cases the only time this person's ever had any personal connection with the paper is you. How do you make sure that you're ready to go and you look very professional? So it's this idea, and again, some of this may be kind of no-brainer stuff, but it's important that you remind your kids of this. Setting up your appointment. I like face-to-face. I know professionally we like face-to-face best, because you get so much more in a face-to-face interview than you do even over the phone. If I had to qualify, prioritize the types of interviews, face-to-face, number 1, key. Second for me would be phone, or I guess if you could Skype or something like that. I guess you kind of get the face-to-face, although the technology is a little weird. But at least you can get immediate responses. And then below that would probably be email. And I say that you say via email when you do that, because you let the readers know that they had time to think about the response and measure it before they responded to you. But face-to-face, the phone at least gives you time for give and take and for listening to responses and being able to follow up on those.
What do you think about someone asks for questions beforehand?
It's a tough one. I guess it sort of depends on the story, and it depends on the source. I mean, if it's a really higher up person. If my reporters have done a good job of explaining themselves in the introductory, they communicate via email and saying to introduce themselves. Hopefully they've done a pretty good job of explaining what kind of story they want to write in the first place and why they're talking to that person, which should kind of cut them off at the pass. I don't know. I guess I don't necessarily see a problem with at least giving them a feel for the questions. I guess it depends on what responses I get back. I mean, I don't want to not do the interview, especially if it's somebody pretty big. I guess I can decide afterwards how I want to play that. I don't know. It's a good question. We've not really had that issue.
Do you grade on interviews? Do you require them to turn in a transcript? Because my kids are just going up to people saying, "Give me a quote."
Yeah. That's about a good question. And certainly I'm a lot more cognizant of that in my intro class because I want to make sure they're doing it right.
I've told them over, they don't listen, they think that's stupid.
I don't, and I'll tell you what I do though, is that this is in here as well, you can skip the slide and get to it, but after every story runs in print, every source that's quoted gets a source questionnaire. And on it
That's a
asks,
good
like,
idea.
the reporter had a scheduled interview, yes or no? The reporter knew me, how did they know me? So I'm trying to not get much interview with friends. All the quotes were accurate, did they have a tape recorder? Did they give you a thank you card? Did they, these kinds of things, we're making sure that they do that. We get about 20% of those back. We assume that the ones that don't come back are fine. But the ones that do come back, most of those are pretty good. We give them to the reporter just to kind of give them some feedback. If there are problems, we can touch base. I can't go on every interview, nor do I want to grade every single one of their stinking interviews at students. Years ago when I was an English teacher, I started to work smarter, not harder too. Like I realized I was grading everything. Like kids would do journals, and I would collect them every 3 weeks, and I'd read all their journal. And then they didn't want me to read it, they'd fold over the page or whatever. And I'd make these inane comments like, oh, that happened to me too, and it's wonderful. I would spend hours doing this, and I'd hand them back, and the kid would go like, thanks. And so I just stopped grading journals, and I realized the point of the journal was really to get them to get to a farther, and so I graded that later part. Same with the interview. The interview is a means to an end, and if the story itself doesn't come out very well, if they have really crappy quotes, it probably means that there's a problem with their interviewing, and now I can go troubleshoot with the kid.
Can we get a copy of that questionnaire?
Yeah, I would,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that'd be
I would
great.
love that.
Yeah, I gotta go find it, but I think they're revamping it, but it's somewhere.
So, these questions, the 15 to 20,
Yeah.
these are for the longer form stories.
Oh, yeah. For a beat report, it doesn't need to be that long, especially as they've made multiple contacts with
Yeah.
sources, and that's kind of the point of the beat, is that you cover it on a regular basis, you get to know these sources. You're gonna just follow up on stuff that you did the last time, and it's usually more casual, sort of on the sources terms on that, in that case.
I've read a few novels on interviewing. One of the things I always tell my students is apply the 10-to-1 rule. If you're gonna have 1 minute of interviewing, you should prepare for 10 minutes with that subject and have a mix of questions, open-ended, closed-ended, hypothetical, tough questions, fun questions, and mix them up so that, you're gonna ask them a tough question, then maybe have a fun question afterwards. You may not use the information, but it'll.
And also understand that this is not a script. You're not following it from beginning to end, and then we get to the end and we're like, the end, and we all bow. It's your way of keeping things on track, that you're ready to go elsewhere. So, and we'll get to this here. The first questions I would have, maybe as we get through this, then we can start to think about where that would go. Those first questions for me, or the big questions, are the first couple are always how do you spell your name? Like Kristen can be spelled about 17 ways, and Bridget, and Brittany, and Kaylin, and just about every 2014 girl name you can think of. And then the second question, and it's not this question, it's just a question like it, is for me a closed-ended yes or no question, and that's your filter question. This is where we test our angle. This is where we're, like the lacrosse story. Like, you think, because this kid's so awesome at lacrosse, and he gets all these awards, like, do you absolutely love lacrosse? And that kid goes, no. Crap, that's where the listening comes in.
Yeah.
What you think he's going to say is, yeah, I think it's awesome. Okay, and then we can proceed with our questions. But if he says no, then you've got to listen to it. You've got to say, well, boom. Now my questions don't make any sense. Why? Why? What don't you like about it? And then you've got to just kind of go off the fly. Hopefully you're doing a good job of recording. I like open-ended questions best. They lead to the better answers. Sometimes you do need close-ended questions depending on the source and depending on the story. If you're doing an investigative piece and you work your way up and you just need a denial or an approval, then yes or no is best. But in most cases with stories, and you're right, it's the open-ended questions that are going to lead to much better responses. We'll talk about what those responses, what our end result, our end game is really in all of this. I like the sort of questions that aren't really questions, that are sort of like procedural stuff, like describe for me this process. You'll get different kinds of sources that will be tough. We do it's a true colors quiz. Some of you are familiar with that. Everybody's got sort of a color that shines brightly for them, and it's sort of their personality trait. There's one called gold, that they're very structured and organized, and if you ask them a yes/no question, they're going to answer yes or no, and that's it. Whereas the orange is, if you ask them a yes/no question, they'll go on for 5 minutes talking about nothing that you asked them about. But I like those sort of describe for me kind of questions, especially for golds, because they're procedural people anyway, and so they're happy to walk you through that process. Hey, we have a technology robotics team. Like, describe for me the build process of the robot from beginning to end. They'll talk forever about that process, and you'll get some good stuff.
How important do you emphasize those verbs in the beginning with asking questions? Because it's something that I do in my regular English classes, that those strong verbs are really important, and they're going to elicit stronger responses rather than tell me about the time when you, whatever, insert.
I think that's less important than the other verbs of like do you versus how do you. I mean, that verb is a far more important one for me. If I say do you, I'm already limiting the response because I'm going to get a yes or no. But if I say how or why, now all of a sudden it's opened it up to a much larger response. I always add these to the end. The first one, and it's important, the word readers is in there. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you think readers should know? It reminds them that they're being interviewed and that their information will be then that final one, how can I get in contact with you? Not just may I get in contact, it's how. Because if your first interview is face-to-face, you're inevitably, especially young reporters, will have some follow-up questions, maybe things they forgot to ask because they were nervous. Maybe the source would just prefer, a different means of communication the second time, just a quick pop-in or phone call or even an email, just for a clarification or something like that. It's really the source's prerogative. They're doing the reporter a favor by making themselves available for this interview, and so we want to do everything we can to make sure that we're not inconveniencing them more than is necessary. Make sure your kids bring materials to interviews. A couple of problems we run into, not only the list of questions, but something to write on. Even if they record, they should still be writing, jotting some things down. Technology can break. If you are using a recorder, make sure they're aware of surrounding noise, like the fan that's running, off to the side, and then make sure you also ask permission. Is it okay if I tape record our interview? Those kinds of things. Have break things to write with, and maybe an extra thing to write with. That'd be embarrassing. You're writing with your pen and it goes out, and you have to ask the source. You have a pen. That's bad. So make sure that they're ready for that.
Oh, I was just gonna say 2 pens.
Yeah. I say tape recorder's optional. I'm still old school. I'm not really a tape recording guy. I've got a pretty good shorthand for quotes, and I'm pretty good at writing things down and still listening to the sources. But I understand their value, and I can always tell when a student who uses a tape recorder versus a student who doesn't, especially when they're new, and it's because of the length of quote. They get terrible quotes when they don't tape record because they miss most of the stuff that the source said. They have no shorthand. On the other hand, kids that tape record sometimes don't know how to edit, and their stories are exceptionally long because they haven't figured out how to pick the best parts of the quotes out and then use them. So there's a kind of a catch-22 in both of those, so just be careful of that. And what do you listen for? What do I tell my kids to listen for? Yeah.
I was going to say, along with that, if they do tape record, I have a student who will transcribe every single one of her interviews before she starts writing. And she writes long-form stories. So there was this story that we had a safety incident at the schools. A kid brought a BB gun to campus as a prop in his theater class. Caused a lockdown. Anyway, but she wrote a story about that. It gave 12 sources, tons of sources.
They transcribed all 12?
Transcribed every single one. And it took her days, weeks. And it was crazy. So,
and by then the story is retold.
Yeah.
So be careful of that. We're looking for, I need to go back, we're looking for storytelling quotes, first of all. Quotes that only the source can say in his or her own words.
Increasingly, in this converged world, you're going to need to create a text version of the story, audio version of the story, maybe the whole interview posted online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you want to see the full transcript of this, or do you want to, of the interview with this person, there is value to that, I guess, if she was going to use those pieces in other ways, but clearly you've got to weigh the time element as well. Like, how long will this take? Can we add that stuff up later? Get the story up quickly. Who is it that's telling me to do 2 different versions of stories for the professional publication, the short form one and the longer form one? Is that you? So that may be an idea as well. And so, you've got these longer quotes that are just powerful quotes. This is one I think I mentioned to you guys, Anna Teresa. This is that quote from the story about a woman whose son was in a terrible school growing up. He was a football player, and he made it to the University of Minnesota, and his mom thought, I've done all this stuff to make my kids safe, and now here he is, he's safe in Wisconsin, University of Minnesota, he's going to get killed at the University of Minnesota. And that was the quote from the mom. It just never ends. That one's actually from a piece from Outside Magazine about a sport called ferret legging. They literally put ferrets in their pants and cinch the belt and hold on. I'm not saying I do this sport.
Yikes.
Yeah, it's called the King of the Ferret Leggers. This is a little Yorkshire man who lives up there, and he's got the world record for ferret legging.
Guess we all need a hobby.
Ferret legging. They call it 2 ferrets in their pants, cinched pants. Reg Miller is his name, and they actually, he was the one who instituted white pants for the competitions. In Yorkshire, England, they have nothing to do up there other than put ferrets in their pants.
Is that where they got the inspiration for Phineas and Ferb's squirrels in their pants?
And I see the bottom of the quote is missing. Though any ferret will eat your eyes out. even if he isn't hungry, he's the rest of that quote. And so, yeah, it's a fun little story, good human interest piece.
I think Rick Riley did that in his My Search for the World's Dumbest
Yeah.
Sport.
This is not Rick Riley, it's a guy from Outside Magazine who wrote it, but it's the same. You're also looking for opinions. You know, you as a reporter aren't sharing your opinion unless you're writing a column. You know, you're trying to be neutral. But the reason you are talking to your sources is because they have opinions on this matter. Hopefully they are informed opinions, credible opinions. But you want them to share their opinions on these aren't real stories. But if you ever had a coach, you know what coach quotes are, right? Quotes that say absolutely nothing. There's a fantastic scene in Bull Durham where Kevin Costner's character is talking to, his name's Crash, he's talking to the new player because he's just messed up television interview. He's like telling him how to talk to the media. Like, you know, just say, you know, God willing, I'm going to play baseball for a lot more. Just giving out 100% effort every day. You know, is what you expect. If Coach ever said this, I totally quote him on. These guys are stupid. They're terrible. It's not my fault. Okay, I'm quoting you on it. Other opinions, you know, let's say there's a dress code story, and in this case, I don't know what happened to answer these quotes. Probably because I had to switch to this large 16 by 9 format. I didn't adjust properly. What do you avoid? I hate this. No room for follow-up here. Also, you're at the mercy of space, and frankly, the source's convenience. I don't care much for emailing questions. Sometimes it's unavoidable. If you do, make sure you say via email. It's important.
Are you okay with phone interviews?
What's that?
Phone interviews, you're okay with them? Yes.
Phone interviews are fine for me because you're talking really, I mean, without the benefit of seeing their face, at least you're getting real, authentic responses.
And I guess one you'd add to that is also like no Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, I hate Facebook and Twitter. Matter of fact, those are off limits for me.
Yeah.
Facebook chat just sounds terribly unprofessional.
Yeah.
For one, you don't even know, frankly, with email, you don't even know if it's the person who's responding is the person you think it is. But plus, with Facebook and stuff, the grammar is horrid. And so how do you transcribe that? Or can you transcribe that? Is that even
Set in context.
Yeah.
Well, we do, because we're online,
Yeah.
and we're a virtual school, and so no one ever is in the same
Right.
country maybe. So we do Skype and we do Google Voice.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, we use Sprout, and they don't post podcasts on their site or on their web, but we use Podbean, so we have a podcast, which is like a radio interview. And they're really good.
Oh, yeah.
I've just been so surprised because
The-
you really get a lot of feeling through the voice, like
Right, and the key to all of this is getting the authentic response. You're there in the moment as opposed to giving time to think about it. Don't like, even when they go into an interview, a kid should have their questions on one area and then a place to write responses in another area. You know, like you're talking to a kid, and if you leave the spaces in between, you know, you're limited by what you've got, and it's sort of like a script. And if I say to Sean, you know, tell me about a significant moment in your life. And Sean says, well, you know, there's that time in like 3rd grade when I knocked over that liquor store. Space. What's your favorite color? It's blue. Awesome. Right, you missed it, right? You didn't have the opportunity. Boy, those coach quotes, the no doubt quotes.
I find that lately, my student reporters have a hard time convincing other students to do face-to-face interviews. Like I have a lot of times the students will say, yeah, I'd like to do a feature story and do a story on this. And the source will just say, well, email me the questions, or Facebook me tonight. Or, you know what I mean, they'll have a hard, they won't want to give my reporter the time of day because they'll just want to do it all electronically. And that's been a very difficult for me.
Wish I had an easy answer for you because you're going to be kids. I mean, that's kind of how it is. Do they have a plan B? Do they have other sources they can talk to? I'd say that may be a starting point. Or just to make sure that the kid lets the source know that, no, unfortunately, I got it. You know, I'm required to do this face-to-face if you've got time, you know.
That's what I was wondering, I mean, do you tell your reporters to just say to mandate to the sources, no, I can't?
I would.
No, I won't.
I would try to do that the best you can. I mean, you'll get some pushback. I'm less concerned about it from students than I am if it's an adult, a teacher that's being pushed for that. But I still, and then if it's a case of teachers are giving a lot of pushback on that, and then I can intervene. I can at least talk to I can send a staff email, just sort of a general, hey guys, I know a lot of you might be getting inundated with questions. First of all, you're under no obligation to be interviewed, but if you do, here are some requirements that I'm looking for. And it kind of lets them see the process. That helps a little bit. No, I'm not as big on that. I guess some people might, but via email is really the big one for me.
Okay.
Because there, they've got time to measure the response, think about it, edit it, come back, and then hit send. Versus a phone where you're still talking to the person, asking the question directly. And not clearly they should identify themselves on the phone when they can call them and, you know, is it okay if I record this, you know, those kinds of things. But I still think that not having a measured response is key. I know we're kind of getting to a stopping point, but I wanted to do this. Okay. This is a spoof.
Now remember, in tennis, love means nothing. It's different than life, where love is everything. Will,
Hey, the guy who falls down, Austin, yes. Wow. I cannot thank you guys enough for doing this. For on a Saturday, it's the only day I had off. You truly are as nice as they say. You must be for doing this on your day off. The door's been locked for a while, so I was just sitting in the private exclusive area.
Yeah, this is,
I'd love to just use the bathroom real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Start. I'm so excited.
It's actually right down
This
there.
means a lot to me. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
we'll
it.
be right there, Bill. It's right down to the left.
To the left.
Yes. The hell. It's Saturday. What's he doing?
What do you want me to do?
I don't know. Just do something, figure something out. I'll see you on stage.
I got a light and I got a cake. I'm sorry.
All right.
I flipped every switch I saw.
This is it, that's all you're doing? All right, so write me some cue cards. I have no idea what to say about him. I know nothing about what he's doing. So just conversational, like at a party. Just. Hey, okay, so.
Nervous.
Oh, don't be nervous. This
Nervous
is,
in front of big crowds.
we don't shoot with an audience.
What do you mean?
You've seen Gladiator, the movie? Well, the Coliseum filled with people, they weren't really there. They're CGI, it's called. That's what we do. We add the audience like. Yes.
Great.
All right.
I'm excited. It's very
Okay.
exciting.
I'll see you in just a minute.
Wait, who else is on the show?
It's Henry Kissinger and Kiss.
Yes.
You know our first guest from such movies as Old School and other things and stuff that he's done that is funny. Without further ado, please welcome Will Ferrell.
Thank you. Tony!
Great to have you on. And hey, how's Saturday Night Live going?
Saturday, well, it's, I guess it's going fine. I'm not doing the show anymore.
I know. Did it sound like, it sounded like that? That's what it sounded like. But I was asking for other people who may not know. What's your favorite meat?
It's, my roast beef. Yeah.
What's your sign?
I'm a Cancer, born in July.
July what?
July 16th.
Happy birthday!
It's cats. For next year, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you like acting?
Yeah, I really like acting. Yeah.
Wow. What do you have coming up?
I have a film called Elf.
Elf?
Yeah. I'm a human that was raised at the North Pole by the elves, not knowing that he wasn't one of them. It's a Christmas kind of...
That sounds funny. Now, is Tim Allen Santa? Is it the same kind of thing?
What did you think he was?
I didn't at all. Some people would, and I ask questions from the people. So, just to make sure, because,
No, it's smart.
you know, do you have any allergies?
Yeah, I do. I just have basic, occasional hay fever.
Oh.
And cats. I'm not great about cats.
No. You're
Great with kids. I don't hate cats.
Clearly, we don't want that happening with our students. It happens sometimes showing them stuff like that can be helpful so they can see the inanity of it. I'll show this presentation to my students and then we'll watch the video, we'll dissect it, and we'll talk about what could she have done better to have a much better interview experience, and it just runs the gamut of just about everything we talk to. I do think the follow-up process is extremely important to an interview. Immediately following the interview, this is something kids don't do very well, but it's verifying quotes. Some of you I know may have procedures where the person maybe initials the responses and things. I don't have something as elaborate as that, but I do want to make sure that when they get done with the interview and they're jotting things down. Now, if it's a tape recorded interview, that's a different story. They've got the quotes right there on the tape recorder, so if there's a problem with the quote, we can always go back to the tape. But if it's a handwritten interview, it's that idea at the end when you say to the source, okay, hey Sandy, when I asked you this, you said this, and then you repeat it back to them word for word. If there's a problem and they correct you, then correct it, read it back again to make sure that you got it accurately portrayed. Like in my shorthand, when I would do that, I put a little star by that to let me know that I've verified that information. It takes a little bit of time, but sources are really not terribly unwilling to do it. They want to make sure that they report it accurately. Always leave that door open for follow-ups and then thank them in person, but then afterwards, kids have got to go over their notes. If their shorthand is anything like mine, it doesn't make sense in about 10 minutes. So make sure that you transcribe things, you get things written in a way that at least is understandable. We have thank you cards on our staff. We just have some stationery that has highlight logo on the front. Every time a source is interviewed, now not for a beat, if they're doing multiple interviews over the course of the year, we'll do it the first time and then not every other time. But any other time they do an interview, I think it's key. It's a little dose of professionalism. I always tell my kids, it's like if you got $20 from grandma at Christmas and you want $20 next year, then you better send a thank you card to grandma that says thank you for sending $20. I mean, it's just a little thing, right? But it goes a long way. Plus, it gets your name out there. It builds that brand. You know, you've got your logo on the front. And it's a little dose of professionalism that really goes a long way in the long run. Then the draft of the story, and then filing things everywhere. Make sure they hold on to that stuff for a long period of time. You never know when people are going to come back and say, well, I never said that. It could be months later. Make sure that that's in a handy spot where they can go back. And then make sure you don't have Stevie glasses on your staff who make up.